In a dramatic hypothetical scenario that would instantly shake the foundations of global politics, the capture of Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro by the United States would trigger an unprecedented wave of reactions from world leaders, exposing deep fractures in the international system and reigniting debates over sovereignty, power, and international law. Washington would immediately defend the operation as a lawful action rooted in long-standing criminal indictments and national security concerns, framing the move as justice rather than aggression, while raising military readiness across the region in anticipation of backlash. Inside Venezuela, the response would be chaotic and volatile, with government officials denouncing the act as an imperial kidnapping, mass protests erupting in the streets, and the military scrambling to assert control amid fears of a sudden power vacuum. Russia would react with fury, condemning the capture as a dangerous precedent and accusing the United States of behaving above international law while using the crisis to rally global opposition against American dominance. China, though more measured in tone, would express serious concern over the erosion of sovereignty norms, quietly calculating how such an action could redefine acceptable behavior among major powers. Across Europe, leaders would be divided between moral opposition to Maduro's rule and alarm over the method of his removal, issuing cautious statements emphasizing due process and stability while privately debating the long-term implications for the rules-based order. Latin American nations would be thrown into alarm, with even governments critical of Maduro fearing that the event signals a return to unilateral interventionism, prompting emergency regional meetings and diplomatic distancing from Washington. At the United Nations, Emergency Security Council sessions would descend into stalemate as rival powers clash, highlighting once again the limits of global institutions in restraining superpowers. Meanwhile, global public opinion would fracture sharply, with some celebrating accountability for an authoritarian leader, while others warn that the incident proves that international law bends to power, leaving smaller nations vulnerable. Ultimately, such an event would not only determine Venezuela's future, but fundamentally alter how the world understands leadership, security, state sovereignty, and the true balance of power in the modern era. As the shock of the hypothetical capture of President Nicolás Maduro continues to ripple across the globe, world leaders would quickly shift from immediate reaction to long-term calculation, recognizing that this moment could redefine how power is exercised in the international system. Governments would begin reassessing security protocols for heads of state, quietly questioning whether diplomatic immunity and sovereignty still offer real protection in an era of unilateral enforcement. U.S. allies, while publicly cautious, would privately debate the strategic message sent by Washington that no leader accused of severe crimes is beyond reach, while also worrying that such a precedent could weaken global norms they rely on for stability. Adversaries of the United States would likely accelerate efforts to harden alliances, expand alternative financial systems, and reduce exposure to U.S. influence, viewing the event as proof that American power can bypass institutions when convenient. In Latin America, the psychological impact would be profound, as nations confront the fear that regional autonomy has been permanently altered, potentially fueling nationalist movements and anti-USS sentiment, even in countries that once aligned closely with Washington. Inside Venezuela, uncertainty would deepen as rival factions struggle to define legitimacy, raising the risk of prolonged instability that could spill across borders through migration, economic collapse, and security threats. At the global level, legal scholars and diplomats would argue intensely over whether this act strengthens accountability or destroys the very framework meant to regulate state behavior, while ordinary citizens worldwide absorb a sobering realization: the rules governing international conduct may be far more fragile than previously believed. In this sense, the capture would not merely be a singular geopolitical event, but a symbolic rupture marking the transition into a world where power, perception, and precedent matter as much as law, and where the consequences of one decision echo far beyond the fate of a single leader. As the international fallout deepens, the hypothetical capture of Nicolás Maduro would begin reshaping diplomatic behavior in subtle but lasting ways, forcing nations to reconsider how conflicts are managed and resolved in a world where precedent now carries a sharper edge. Smaller and non-aligned states would grow increasingly cautious in their foreign policies, avoiding overt confrontation with major powers while investing more heavily in internal security and diplomatic hedging, aware that neutrality may no longer guarantee safety. Human rights organizations would find themselves divided, torn between the principle of accountability for alleged abuses and the fear that bypassing international courts undermines the legitimacy of justice itself. Meanwhile, intelligence agencies worldwide would intensify operations, anticipating retaliatory cyber attacks, covert influence campaigns, and asymmetric responses designed to avoid open war while still imposing costs. Global markets, already sensitive to instability, would react nervously to prolonged uncertainty in energy supply, particularly if Venezuelan oil exports remain disrupted by political paralysis. Within academic and policy circles, the event would be analyzed as a defining case study of 21st century power projection, demonstrating how legal arguments, military capability, and narrative control converge to shape outcomes. Over time, the incident would become a reference point in diplomatic negotiations, quietly invoked as a reminder of what happens when disputes escalate beyond institutions. In this broader sense, the episode would symbolize a shift away from predictable rules toward a more volatile global environment where leaders must weigh not only what is lawful or moral, but what is possible, and whether the international community can still agree on where the line between justice and dominance truly lies. In the final phase of this hypothetical global reckoning, the capture of Nicolás Maduro would settle into history not merely as an isolated incident, but as a lasting symbol of a world entering a more confrontational and uncertain era, where deterrence is shaped as much by example as by diplomacy. Governments would quietly adjust their behavior, with some leaders becoming more insulated and authoritarian out of fear, while others seek stronger international alliances to avoid isolation and vulnerability. The United States, having demonstrated its reach, would face a paradox of power commanding fear and respect simultaneously, yet struggling to rebuild trust among nations that now question its commitment to shared rules. Over time, the Venezuela crisis would be cited in speeches, policy papers, and military doctrines as a moment when the balance between law and force visibly shifted, accelerating the erosion of consensus that once governed global conduct. For ordinary people, especially in smaller or unstable countries, the episode would reinforce a sobering reality. Global stability depends less on guarantees than on restraint, and when restraint fails, consequences ripple far beyond borders. As memories of the immediate shock fade, the deeper impact would remain a world more alert, more divided, and more cautious, where leaders govern with the knowledge that power can move swiftly, norms can fracture suddenly, and history can pivot on a single decision made in the shadows of global attention. As the world gradually absorbs the long-term implications of this hypothetical event, the capture of Nicolás Maduro would come to be viewed as a warning etched into modern history, a moment that exposed how fragile the international order truly is when confronted by overwhelming power and unresolved global tensions. Diplomatic language would subtly change in the years that follow, with negotiations carrying an unspoken edge and security guarantees framed more cautiously than before. Nations once confident in multilateral protection would invest more heavily in self-reliance, intelligence capabilities, and regional blocs, recognizing that global consensus can fracture under pressure. The idea of accountability, once tied primarily to international courts and institutions, would become increasingly politicized, shaped by who enforces justice rather than how justice is defined. For future leaders, the episode would linger as a silent calculation in every major decision, whether defiance is worth the risk, whether compromise is safer than confrontation, and whether the global system rewards cooperation or punishes vulnerability. In this sense, the event's greatest impact would not be immediate retaliation or diplomatic fallout, but the slow, invisible shift in how power is understood and exercised, leaving behind a world that moves forward more cautiously, more strategically, and with a deeper awareness that the line between order and chaos is far thinner than it once appeared.